The thin ribbon of smoke was the first thing Jasper Thorne saw, and it was the last thing he ever expected to see. It rose from the stone chimney of his cabin, a pale gray question mark against the vast, indifferent blue of the Wyoming sky. For a man who had spent the last 10 years making sure he was hard to find, the sight was a violation. It felt like a shout in a church. His horse, a seasoned buckskin named Dust, felt the change in him, the sudden tension in the reins, and its ears swiveled, flicking back and forth. Jasper pulled the horse to a halt behind a screen of lodgepole pines, his hand going not to the Winchester in its scabbard, but to the Colt Peacemaker holstered low on his hip. The leather of the grip was worn smooth as a river stone from a decade of familiarity. He had built that cabin with his own 2 hands, miles from any town, on a piece of land no one else wanted, precisely so he would never see unexpected smoke rising from its chimney. He had just spent 2 weeks guiding a surveyor through the Bighorn Mountains, earning enough coin to see him through the winter. He was bone-tired and trail-sore, looking forward to nothing more than the profound silence of his own 4 walls. But silence was not what was waiting for him. Someone was in his home. It could be a drifter, desperate for shelter. It could be a claim jumper, testing the property's defenses. Or it could be someone from his past, a past he had ridden hundreds of miles and shed his own name to escape. Jasper swung down from the saddle, his movements fluid and quiet. He tethered Dust loosely, leaving the horse where it could break away if shooting started. He drew the Colt, the metallic click of the hammer being pulled back seeming to echo in the hot summer air. Every instinct, honed by years of staying alive when other men did not, screamed at him. He moved through the trees like a ghost, circling around to the front of the cabin. The door was slightly ajar. He smelled old wood smoke, but something else too. Something faint and floral, a scent that had no place in his world of dust, leather, and pine. He paused beside the single window, listening. He heard nothing. No voices, no bootsteps, just the crackle of a dying fire. Taking a deep breath, he moved to the door and kicked it open, stepping inside fast and low, the barrel of the Colt sweeping the room. And then he froze. The cabin was small, just a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a bed built into the wall. Huddled by the hearth, where only a few embers glowed, was a woman. She was small, thin as a willow switch, and looked more like a half-starved apparition than a person. She was wrapped in what was left of a dress, a garment so torn and filthy it was hard to tell what it had once been. But the color, a pale, washed-out pink, and the high, stiff collar hinted at something fine and foreign. Her hair was a black, tangled mess, and her face was smudged with soot, but it was her eyes that held him. They were wide with a terror so pure and absolute it struck him with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't a threat. She was a victim. She flinched as he stood there, the gun still raised, and made a small, whimpering sound, pressing herself harder against the cold stones of the fireplace. Jasper slowly, deliberately, lowered the hammer on the Colt and holstered it. The simple gesture seemed to take a monumental effort. He had been ready for a fight, for violence, for a confrontation with the ghosts of his past. He was not ready for this. He took a step forward, and she scrambled away, crab-walking towards the corner of the room like a frightened animal. He stopped. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at him, her dark eyes unblinking, not understanding the words but reading the softened tone. He could see the bones in her face, the sharp line of her jaw, the hollows beneath her cheeks. She was Chinese. He'd seen railroad workers in the bigger towns, men with long queues and weary faces, but never a woman. And certainly not one dressed in the ghost of a silk gown, alone in the middle of the Wyoming wilderness. He raised his hands slowly, palms out, showing they were empty. He backed away towards the table, giving her space. He pointed to himself. "Jasper," she just stared. He tried again, pointing to the chair. "Sit." Nothing. She was like a deer caught in the open, frozen and waiting for the killing blow. He realized she was beyond reason, lost in fear and exhaustion. He turned his back on her, a calculated risk, and walked to the small pantry. He took out a piece of hardtack and a strip of jerky he'd been saving. He placed them on the table, then poured a cup of water from the bucket by the door. He pushed the table gently with his foot until it was closer to her, then he retreated to the doorway, sitting on the threshold with his back to her, watching the sun dip below the mountains. He was giving her a choice, to trust him enough to eat, or to starve in his corner. He sat there for what felt like an hour, listening to the silence. Then, he heard it. The scrape of a chair, a faint rustle, and the sound of someone drinking water, fast and desperate. He did not turn around. He just watched the sky turn from orange to purple, and wondered what in God's name he was going to do now. He slept on the floor by the door that night, a barrier between her and the outside world, and between her and him. He left her the bed. He doubted she slept, but at some point in the deep, quiet hours of the morning, exhaustion must have claimed her. When dawn broke, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, he saw she had curled into the smallest possible space on the edge of the mattress, still fully dressed in her ruined finery. She looked impossibly fragile. He made a fire and put coffee on to boil, the familiar ritual a comfort in the strange new reality of his life. The smell of the coffee finally roused her. She sat up, her movements stiff, her eyes darting to him, then to the door, assessing her situation. He poured 2 cups, took one for himself, and pushed the other onto the table near her side. He added a dollop of precious condensed milk to it, a luxury he rarely afforded himself. She watched his every move. He gestured to the cup. She hesitated, then slowly, she crept from the bed and took it, her hands trembling so much she had to use both to hold it steady. She took a tentative sip. Her eyes widened slightly at the sweetness. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the wall of her fear. He knew he couldn't keep her here. The cabin was a sanctuary, but it was also a trap. He was low on flour, salt, and coffee. He needed to go to town. The thought of leaving her alone was impossible, but the thought of taking her with him was worse. Redemption Gulch was a hard town, a collection of miners, ranchers, and drifters who were suspicious of anything new, and downright hostile to anything they didn't understand. A lone gunman showing up with a Chinese woman would be like throwing a match into a powder keg. But there was no choice. The wilderness would kill her if he turned her out, and she would starve if they stayed. He found an old shirt of his and a spare pair of canvas trousers. They were ridiculously large for her, but they were sturdy and plain. He laid them on the bed, then pointed to her tattered pink dress. He made a gesture of taking it off and putting the new clothes on. She stared at the clothes, then at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. She shook her head, clutching the silk rags to her body as if they were armor. He understood. It was the last piece of who she was. He didn't push. He packed a few supplies, checked his rifle, and whistled for dust. When he brought the horse to the cabin door, the woman watched from the shadows, her face a mask of apprehension. He pointed to her, then to the horse, then made a gesture of riding. He was taking her with him. Fear warred with something else in her expression. The cabin was a known quantity, but it was also a cage with him in it. The world outside was a terrifying unknown. He mounted Dust, then extended a hand down to her. "It's all right," he said again, the words feeling useless. "I'll keep you safe." She stood there for a long moment, a tiny, forlorn figure against the vast landscape. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she walked forward and took his hand. Her fingers were like ice. He pulled her up, seating her in front of him on the saddle. She was light as a feather. He wrapped one arm around her waist to keep her steady, and she went rigid at the contact. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his chest. As they rode, he felt a profound sense of dread. He was not just riding to town for supplies. He was riding into a fight he didn't know if he could win. The ride to Redemption Gulch took half a day. The woman, who he had started to think of as Rose for the faded color of her dress, sat stiffly in front of him, her body a rigid line of tension. She did not speak, did not make a sound, only watched the passing landscape with wide, haunted eyes. Jasper felt the stares before he even reached the main street. A freighter hauling timber stopped his team to watch them pass. A pair of prospectors leaning against the assayer's office fell silent, their eyes following the strange pair. Redemption Gulch was a raw, unpolished town carved out of the wilderness, and its welcome was as rough as its clapboard storefronts. Jasper ignored the looks. He kept his face impassive, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his hand resting casually on his thigh, inches from his Colt. He rained dust in before the general store, the largest and most central building in town. He dismounted, then turned to help her down. She slid from the saddle, her legs unsteady, and she stumbled against him. For a moment, she leaned on him, her small frame trembling, and he felt a protective instinct so fierce it startled him. He steadied her, his hand on her arm, and then released her as if burned. "Stay close," he muttered, knowing she wouldn't understand the words but hoping she'd grasp the intent. The interior of the store was dim and smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and chewing tobacco. A few men lingered by the counter, their conversation dying as Jasper and Rose entered. The storekeeper, a balding man named Miller, looked up from his ledger, his eyes widening as they landed on Rose. "Thorn," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Didn't expect to see you in town and needed supplies, Miller," Jasper said, his voice flat. He handed a list across the counter. Miller took it but didn't look at it. His gaze was fixed on Rose, who had shrunk behind Jasper, trying to make herself invisible. "Who's this, then?" Miller asked, a smirk playing on his lips. Before Jasper could answer, the door swung open again, and Sterling Croft walked in. Croft owned the biggest ranch in the valley, controlled the water rights, and held the deed on half the businesses in town. He was a man who dressed in a tailored suit even in the summer heat, his silver hair perfectly combed, his face a mask of pleasant authority. But Jasper knew that beneath the polished exterior was a man as ruthless as a wolf. Croft's eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over Jasper and came to rest on Rose. His polite smile tightened. Well, Thorn," Croft said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I see you've brought company." The way he said the word made it an insult. "She needed help," Jasper said, his tone a clear warning. Croft let out a soft chuckle. "Help? That's what you call it? We have certain standards in this community. We don't take kindly to vagrants and their keepers, especially this kind." He gestured dismissively towards Rose. The other men in the store shifted, their expressions hardening, taking their cue from Croft. Jasper felt the familiar cold knot tighten in his gut. This was it. The public test. He had hoped to get in and out quietly, but Croft would not allow it. He wanted to make an example of them. Croft took a step closer. "This is a decent town, Thorn. We won't have it sullied. I suggest you take your property and ride on. Don't come back." The air grew thick and heavy. Miller stood frozen behind the counter. The other men watched, waiting to see what Jasper would do. He was one man against the town's most powerful citizen. But as the tension stretched to its breaking point, something unexpected happened. An old ranch hand near the back of the store suddenly let out a strangled cough, clutching his chest and stumbling against a barrel of nails. His face turned a frightening shade of purple. Miller shouted his name, Jed, but no one moved, unsure what to do. Rose, however, did not hesitate. She darted out from behind Jasper, her fear momentarily forgotten. She moved with a strange, fluid grace, her small hands reaching for the man's wrist, her fingers pressing against his pulse point with an unnerving confidence. The man was choking. Without a word, she spun him around, wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, made a fist, and gave a sharp, upward thrust just below his ribs. A piece of dried apple, which he had been chewing, shot out of his mouth and landed on the dusty floorboards. Jed gasped, sucking in a great, shuddering breath of air. The color began to return to his face. Rose stepped back, her duty done, and immediately retreated to the shadows behind Jasper, her brief moment of authority vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The store was utterly silent. Everyone, including Sterling Croft, stared at her, then at the piece of apple, then at the gasping man. She had just saved his life. And in doing so, she had completely upended Croft's narrative. She was not helpless property. she was something else entirely. The silence in the general store was a living thing. Jed, the old ranch hand, leaned against the counter, still breathing heavily, his eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and astonishment as he looked at the small woman half hidden behind Jasper. Sterling Croft's face, for the first time Jasper could remember, was a mask of genuine surprise, his carefully constructed scene shattered. Croft recovered first. He cleared his throat, his polite smile returning, though it didn't quite reach his cold eyes. "A fortunate bit of luck," he said, attempting to regain control. "Nevertheless, the point stands. This is no place for her," but the moment had passed. The other men in the store were no longer looking at Rose with suspicion, but with a grudging respect. Jed pushed himself upright. She saved me, Mr. Croft," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "I was choking for sure." Jasper saw his opening. He stepped forward, placing himself between Croft and Rose, a silent, unmovable wall. "Her name is not her," Jasper said, his voice low and steady, but carrying to every corner of the store. "And she is not my property. She's under my protection. We're getting our supplies, and then we're leaving. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." Right now he didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch his gun. He simply stood there, his gaze locked on Croft, and let the weight of his reputation fill the room. The men in the store knew who Jasper Thorne was, or at least, they knew the stories. They knew he was a man who sought peace but was dangerously capable of violence. Croft held his gaze for a long moment, the muscles in his jaw working. He was a man used to getting his way through influence and veiled threats, not open confrontation. He had misjudged the situation, and he knew it. Finally, with a look of pure venom directed at Jasper, he gave a curt nod. "As you wish," he said, his voice clipped. "Miller, give the man what he wants." We wouldn't want to delay him. He turned on his heel and strode out of the store, the batwing doors swinging shut behind him. The tension broke. Miller, sweating profusely, hurried to fill Jasper's order, piling sacks of flour, beans, and coffee on the counter. The other men avoided Jasper's eyes, but they nodded towards Rose with a new kind of deference. Jed walked over, hat in his hands. He said to her, his voice full of genuine awe. "I don't know what to say." "Thank you." Rose just looked at him with her wide, uncomprehending eyes, then glanced at Jasper, seeking guidance. Jasper paid Miller, the clink of coin on the wood counter unnaturally loud. He loaded the supplies into his saddlebags, his movements deliberate. He knew this was not over. He had won the skirmish, but in publicly defying Sterling Croft, he had declared war. Croft was not a man to forgive a humiliation. As they mounted up to leave, Jasper felt the weight of eyes on his back. He had drawn a line in the sand, not just for himself, but for the silent woman who rode before him. The ride back to the cabin was different. She was still tense, but it was a different kind of tension. She sat a little straighter. Once, when a deer darted across their path, she made a small, soft sound, a note of wonder. He glanced down at her. In the harsh sunlight, he could see the fine, intricate embroidery on the collar of her ruined dress, a pattern of blossoms and birds almost completely obscured by grime. He had defended her, and in doing so, had bound himself to her in a way that went beyond mere charity. He was no longer just a man hiding from his past. He was a man with something to protect. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Croft would come for it. Back in the quiet sanctuary of the cabin, the world shrank to four walls and a stone hearth. The confrontation in town had changed something between them. The space was no longer filled with just her fear and his caution. A fragile thread of trust had been spun. That evening, as the shadows grew long, he watched her at the fireplace. She had taken a piece of charcoal from the hearth and was drawing on a flat, smooth stone she'd found by the creek. Her focus was absolute, her small hands moving with a delicate precision that seemed at odds with her wretched condition. Jasper sat at the table, cleaning his colt, the familiar ritual of oil and steel a calming counterpoint to the turmoil of the day. He watched her from the corner of his eye. He was a man of few words, and she was a woman of none he could understand. Yet, he felt a desperate need to know who she was, where she had come from. After a while, she seemed to sense his gaze and looked up. She held the stone out to him. He put down his pistol and walked over, taking it from her. On its surface was a drawing, simple but clear. It showed a great ship with many sails on a vast ocean. Then she took the stone back, wiped it clean with her sleeve, and drew again. This time, it was a city of strange, curved roofs, crowded together. She pointed to herself. Then she drew a man with a kind face, and a woman with an elaborate hairstyle, and she touched her heart. Her parents. The story unfolded in a series of these fleeting images. A wagon train heading east, not west. A group of hard-faced men. A drawing of a different man, this one with a cruel, sneering mouth, and a big house. She drew herself, handing a bag of coins to the hard-faced men, then a picture of herself running, her drawn face a mask of terror. Jasper pieced it together. She was not a peasant or a laborer. The fine dress, her delicate hands, the way she carried herself, it all made a terrible kind of sense. She was the daughter of a wealthy family, perhaps a merchant in the great port city of San Francisco. She had been promised, sold, to some powerful man on the other side of the country. The men on the wagon train were her escorts, or her guards. But she had escaped. She had run, with nothing but the clothes on her back, into the unforgiving Wyoming wilderness. He looked from the drawing to her face, seeing her not as a problem or a stray, but as a person with a history as painful as his own. She reached up and touched a small, green stone that hung from a silken cord around her neck. It was a pendant, so grimy he hadn't noticed it before. She worked it free and held it out to him on the palm of her hand. It was jade, exquisitely carved in the shape of a crane. It was a thing of immense quality and value, the last remnant of her former life. He gently pushed her hand back, closing her fingers over the stone. He shook his head. He wouldn't take it. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear. It was a profound, heartbreaking weariness, but it was edged with a quiet strength. That was who she was. Not a princess, not a victim, but a survivor. The knowledge settled in his chest with a heavy weight. Her past was not as far behind her as his was. The man she was running from, a man powerful enough to buy a bride and have her shipped across the country, would not give up so easily. And now, she was tied to him, and he to her. They were two fugitives, hiding together in a lonely cabin, with the world closing in. The rehook was no longer just about Croft. A new, more personal danger was now on the horizon. He did not yet know that the men she had fled were not just a memory. They were a hunting party, and they were getting closer every day. A week passed in quiet routine. A strange, domestic peace settled over the cabin. He taught her to shoot the Winchester, her small frame braced against the recoil. She, in turn, showed him which wild greens were edible and which roots could be ground into a poultice for his horse's strained leg. They communicated through a growing language of gestures, shared tasks, and single words. He learned her name was Leanne when she carefully drew two complex symbols in the dirt. He pointed to them and said, "Leanne." She nodded, a rare, brilliant smile lighting up her face. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, and it hit him with an unexpected force. He found himself watching her, the way her hands moved as she mended his shirt with thread she had painstakingly unraveled from her own ruined dress, the way she would hum a soft, melodic tune as she tended the small garden she had started behind the cabin. The walls of the cabin, once his fortress against the world, were becoming a home. But the peace was fragile, and Jasper knew it. Every time he looked towards the trail leading from town, he expected to see trouble. He expected Croft. He did not expect the three riders who appeared at dusk, their horses dark silhouettes against the blood-red sunset. They were not cowboys. They were Chinese, dressed in the dark, practical clothes of railroad foreman or hired muscle, and they rode with a grim purpose. Leanne saw them first. She was by the creek, gathering water, when she let out a sharp, terrified cry. It was not a sound of surprise. It was a sound of recognition. Jasper was chopping wood and dropped the axe, his hand instantly going to his Colt. He saw the riders, and he saw the look on Leanne's face as she scrambled back towards the cabin. These were the men from her drawings. The men she had run from. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a flat, impassive face and a long, thin scar bisecting his left eyebrow, reined in his horse 20 yards from the cabin. His eyes were cold and empty. He ignored Jasper completely, his gaze fixed on Leanne, who now stood frozen by the door. "We have come for what belongs to our master," the man said, his English heavily accented but clear. His name, Jasper would later learn, was Bao. "The girl comes with us," as Jasper stepped in front of Leanne, shielding her with his body. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Bao's gaze shifted to Jasper for the first time, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "This does not concern you, farmer. This is a business matter. She is a runaway. There is a contract. The contract ends here," Jasper said. He could feel Leanne trembling behind him. He could smell the sweat and dust of the trail on the men, see the hardness in their eyes. These were not men like Croft, who used lawyers and intimidation. These were men who used knives and fists. Bao sighed, a theatrical display of impatience. "Do not be a fool. You are one man. My master, Mr. Guan, is a very important man. He is building the railroad. He does not like to be disappointed. Give us the girl, and we will even give you a few dollars for your trouble." He reached into a steel bag and pulled out a small cloth pouch that jingled with coin. He tossed it on the ground between them. "Take the money. Forget you saw her." Jasper didn't even glance at the pouch. He looked at Bao, then at the other two men, who had fanned out, their hands resting on the hilts of the long knives tucked into their belts. This was not a negotiation. It was a demand backed by the threat of swift, brutal violence. "Last chance," Jasper said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Ride out. Bao's impassive face finally broke into a cold smile. "I was afraid you would be stupid." He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to his men. The man on the right went for his knife. He never cleared the leather. Jasper's Colt was in his hand, the report echoing through the valley as the man was thrown from his saddle, a dark stain spreading on his chest. The second man, startled, drew his own weapon, but he was clumsy with surprise. Jasper fired again. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder as his horse shied and bolted. Everything had happened in less than 2 seconds. Bao sat on his horse, his cold smile gone, replaced by a look of shocked fury. He had profoundly underestimated the quiet man in front of the cabin. He had mistaken a sleeping wolf for a farm dog. Bao snarled a curse and spurred his horse forward, drawing a heavy, curved blade. He was not aiming for Jasper. He was aiming for Leanne. Bao charged, his blade flashing in the dying light, a fearsome weapon meant to intimidate and maim. Jasper, having just fired 2 shots, knew he couldn't get a third aimed in time. He did the only thing he could. He threw himself at Leanne, tackling her and pushing her through the cabin door, the two of them landing in a heap on the floorboards as Bao's horse thundered past. The tip of the blade sliced through the air where Leanne's head had been a second before. Jasper scrambled to his feet, pulling Leanne with him and shoving her towards the back of the room. "Stay down," he yelled. He turned back to the doorway, leveling his Colt, but Bao was already wheeling his horse around for another pass. The other wounded man was on the ground, trying to get to his feet, his gun lost in the dust. Jasper knew he was in a bad position. He was framed in the doorway, a perfect target. He fired at Bao, the bullet splintering the wood of the doorframe as Bao ducked low against his horse's neck. A shot answered from the dusk. The wounded man had found his pistol. The bullet tore through the wall of the cabin, inches from Jasper's head, showering him with splinters. He was trapped. Pinned down in his own home, with one man on foot and another on horseback, both intent on killing him. He dropped to one knee, using the door frame for cover, and fired again. The wounded man cried out and fell silent. One threat down. But Bao was the real danger. He was skilled and relentless. He dismounted, using his horse for cover, and began to move stealthily towards the side of the cabin, trying to get a better angle. Jasper could hear the soft thud of his footsteps in the dirt. The cabin, once his sanctuary, was now a death trap. The thin log walls wouldn't stop a bullet. He glanced back at Leanne. She was not cowering in the corner as he had expected. Her face was pale with terror, but her eyes were alive with a fierce, desperate intelligence. She was looking at the fireplace, then at the Winchester rifle mounted above it. She pointed at it, then at the single small window on the cabin's side wall. The same side bow was creeping along. Jasper understood immediately. It was a desperate gamble. He would have to provide a distraction, drawing Bow's attention to the front while she got the rifle and moved to the window. He looked at her, and she met his gaze, her expression grim but resolute. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was a plan made in a silent glance, a pact sealed in a moment of shared peril. "Now!" Jasper shouted. He burst from the doorway, firing his Colt rapidly towards Bow's horse, not to hit it, but to make it panic. The horse screamed and reared, pulling away from Bow and leaving him exposed for a split second. Bow cursed and fired back, his shot going wide as he fought for cover. In that same moment, Leanne scrambled onto a chair, her small hands grabbing the heavy Winchester. It was almost as tall as she was. She didn't try to aim it from her shoulder. Instead, she rested the long barrel on the sill of the small side window, just as Jasper had taught her. Her face was a mask of concentration. Jasper dove back behind the doorframe as Bow, recovering his composure, leveled his pistol. He was taking careful aim now, preparing for the killing shot. He didn't see the rifle barrel appear in the window just a few feet away from him. The roar of the Winchester inside the small cabin was deafening. The kick sent Leanne stumbling backward, but her shot was true. Bow stiffened, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He looked down at the new, dark hole in his chest, then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed into the dust. Silence fell, thick and absolute, broken only by the ringing in Jasper's ears. He slowly stood up, his Colt still in hand, and looked out. The two men were down. The third had long since ridden off. The immediate danger was over. He turned and looked at Leanne. She stood in the middle of the room, the heavy rifle clutched in her hands, her body trembling from adrenaline and shock. She had not been a damsel to be rescued. In the final, crucial moment, she had been his partner. She had saved his life. The aftermath was grim. By the last light of day, Jasper dragged the bodies away from the cabin and dealt with them in the way the frontier demanded, a grim task performed in silence. Leanne watched him from the doorway, her face pale, her hand still trembling. When he was done, he walked back to the cabin, the weight of the last hour settling on him. He had killed men before, many times, but never in defense of a home. Never in defense of another person. He stopped before her, and she looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with 1,000 questions he couldn't answer. He reached out and gently took the heavy Winchester from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers, and a current passed between them, a recognition of the line they had just crossed together. They had faced death and survived, not as a protector and his ward, but as equals. That night, no words were spoken. None were needed. The shared violence had forged a bond deeper than language. He cleaned the rifles, and she washed her face and hands in the water bucket, her movement slow and deliberate. When he finally banked the fire for the night, he unrolled his bedroll on the floor, as he had every night. He lay down, staring into the darkness, his mind replaying the gunfight. He heard a soft rustle. Leanne had left the bed. She crossed the small room and lay down on the floor a few feet away from him, pulling her own thin blanket around her. She was not seeking his comfort, nor was she afraid of him. She was simply choosing not to be alone. It was a statement of solidarity, a quiet declaration that they were in this together. Lying there in the dark, Jasper Thorne felt something inside him shift. The solitude he had cultivated for a decade no longer felt like safety. It felt like emptiness. The woman sleeping a few feet away from him, a stranger who had stumbled into his life, had filled a space he hadn't even known was hollow. He had come to this valley seeking to be left alone, to outrun the man he used to be. But the world had found him anyway. First in the form of Sterling Croft's greed, and then in the form of Leanne's past. He could run again. He could take her to a bigger town, put her on a stagecoach to somewhere safer, and disappear back into the wilderness. But the thought brought him no relief. It felt like a betrayal. He had made a promise in the Redemption Gulch General Store, a promise spoken to Croft but meant for her. He would protect her. And as he lay there, listening to the soft sound of her breathing, he realized it was a promise he intended to keep, no matter the cost. The ghosts of his past no longer seemed so threatening compared to the very real danger of losing the future that was just beginning to take shape within these four walls. 3 months later, the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks of the Bighorns. The aspen trees in the valley had turned a brilliant gold and then shed their leaves. The air was crisp and clean. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. A sturdy new corral stood behind the barn, and the garden Leanne had planted had yielded a surprising bounty of squash, beans, and potatoes, now stored for the winter. Inside, shelves lined one wall, holding neatly stacked jars of preserves. A colorful, hand-stitched quilt covered the bed, made from salvaged scraps of cloth. Leanne and Jasper had fallen into a rhythm that felt as natural as the changing seasons. Their language was still a patchwork of English, gestures, and a handful of Chinese words he had learned, but they understood each other perfectly. He had taught her to read a few simple words in an old almanac, and she had shown him how to weave strong cordage from plant fibers. He had not seen or heard anything from Sterling Croft. The story of the fight at Jasper's cabin had spread through Redemption Gulch like wildfire. The tale grew with each telling, but the core facts remained. Jasper Thorne, with the help of the Chinese woman, had faced down 3 armed men and won. Croft, a man who preyed on the weak, had no interest in tangling with a man who was demonstrably not. One crisp October afternoon, Jasper rode back from town, a packet of official-looking papers tucked inside his coat. He found Leanne by the creek, not gathering water, but sketching in a small notebook he had bought for her. She was drawing the mountains, her expression one of serene concentration. She looked up as he approached, and a real, untroubled smile lit her face. He dismounted and handed her the papers. It was a copy of his filing under the Homestead Act, the official claim to the 160 acres of land they lived on. She looked at the papers, her brow furrowed in confusion. He took them back and pointed to the top line, where he had written his name, Jasper Thorne. Then he pointed to the line below it, the one designated for a spouse. He had written her name there, Leanne Thorne. Her eyes widened. She looked from the paper to his face, a storm of emotions passing through her. He had given her more than protection. He had given her a name, a home, and a legal standing in a world that had tried to erase her. A contract, he said softly, using the same word Bao had used. He pointed to the paper, then to her, then to himself. Our contract, she understood. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of fear or sorrow. She reached out and touched the paper, her fingers tracing the letters of her new name. Then she looked up at him, and her smile was the brightest thing in the valley. That evening, they sat on the small porch he had added to the cabin, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The smoke rising from their chimney was no longer a sign of intrusion, but a beacon of warmth and belonging. Jasper Thorne had come to this place to be alone, to escape a life of violence. But a woman in a ragged pink dress had stumbled into his solitude and shown him that a life was not something you ran from, but something you built, together. And in the quiet peace of that Wyoming evening, he knew he was finally home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.